The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the noise. It was the chairs. I woke up that morning expecting a normal Saturday. Coffee, a quiet walk around the backyard, maybe some time fixing the old wooden fence near the oak tree. Instead, when I stepped onto my porch, I saw rows of white folding chairs being unloaded from a truck and carried straight through the side gate of my property, like the place belonged to someone else. At first, I honestly thought they had the wrong address. Two men in matching polo shirts were measuring the grass near the oak tree with a tape measure, while a woman with a clipboard stood nearby, pointing at different spots in my yard. "Arch goes here," she said. "Seating rows start about 10 feet back." I stood there for a moment trying to process what I was seeing. My backyard wasn't small, but it definitely wasn't some public park either. It was fenced, clearly marked private property, and I had lived there long enough that everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly where the property line was. Yet somehow these people were acting like they had every right to be there. I walked down the porch steps and across the yard until I was close enough for them to notice me. Can I help you?" I asked. The woman with the clipboard looked up and smiled, like I was the one interrupting her schedule. "Oh, perfect," she said. "You must be the homeowner. We're just doing the layout for the ceremony." I blinked. "The ceremony?" "Yes," she said casually, while checking something on her clipboard. "The wedding this weekend." For a second I thought she was joking. Then I noticed the truck outside my gate. More decorations were being unloaded. Boxes of flowers, metal stands, even a rolled-up white carpet. My brain was still trying to catch up. "I think you've got the wrong house," I told her. She frowned slightly and flipped through a few pages before turning the clipboard toward me. Printed across the top was a document labeled Willowbrook Garden Wedding Venue Reservation, and right underneath it was my home address. I stared at the paper. "This property," she continued confidently, "was reserved through the HOA. The president personally approved it as the venue." That's when the first real wave of confusion hit me. Because I had lived in this neighborhood for 8 years, and in those 8 years the HOA had never once asked permission to use my backyard for anything, let alone a wedding. If you lived in Willowbrook long enough, you eventually learnt one name that could ruin your entire day. Priscilla Davenport, the president of our HOA. Some neighborhoods have friendly HOA boards that organize barbecues and remind people to trim their hedges. Willowbrook had Priscilla. She was the kind of person who carried a clipboard like it was a weapon and treated every homeowner like a rule-breaking criminal waiting to be fined. If your trash bin was visible for more than an hour after pickup, Priscilla noticed. If your grass grew half an inch above the limit, Priscilla noticed. If your mailbox leaned slightly to the left, you could bet a warning letter would appear in your mailbox the next morning. No one really liked her, but people tolerated her because she knew the bylaws better than anyone else, and she wasn't shy about using them. So when I saw a black SUV pull up outside my gate about 20 minutes after the wedding planners arrived, I already had a pretty good idea who was inside. The driver's door opened, and sure enough, Priscilla stepped out like she owned the street, perfectly pressed blazer. Sunglasses, even though the sun was barely out. Clipboard tucked under one arm. She walked straight through my open gate without even acknowledging me. "Morning," she said, glancing around the yard like an event manager inspecting a venue. "Priscilla," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm. "Why are there people setting up wedding decorations in my backyard?" She removed her sunglasses and gave me the kind of smile people use when they think they're explaining something obvious to a child. "Oh, that," she said dismissively. "The HOA approved this space for a community event. A wedding isn't a community event," I replied. "It is when the HOA schedules it," she said. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. "You scheduled a wedding in my backyard?" "Yes," she said simply. "It's a beautiful open space, and the couple was looking for something charming and intimate. I thought this would be perfect." "You thought?" Priscilla sighed like I was the one being difficult. Technically, she continued, tapping her clipboard, your yard falls within what the HOA designates as a community scenic zone that allows us to use it for neighborhood gatherings. I had lived there for 8 years. I had read the HOA rules more times than I cared to admit, and I knew for a fact that rule didn't exist, which meant one thing. Priscilla hadn't just scheduled a wedding on my property. She had completely made up the authority to do it. By the next morning, my backyard didn't look like my backyard anymore. It looked like a construction site for a fairy tale wedding. When I stepped outside with my coffee, another truck was already parked in front of my gate. 2 workers were carrying a massive wooden arch wrapped in plastic while someone else rolled out what looked like a white aisle runner across my lawn, like they'd been doing weddings there for years. For a moment I just stood on the porch staring at it. Yesterday it had been a few people measuring the yard. Today it was a full operation. A delivery van arrived with boxes of flowers. Another truck brought folding tables and stacks of chairs. Someone started installing string lights between my oak tree and the fence posts, like they were decorating a venue that had always belonged to them. The worst part, nobody even asked anymore. They just walked through the gate and started working. I marched down the yard toward a man unloading equipment from the truck. "Hey," I called out, "you can't set this stuff up here." The man barely looked up. "We're with Willowbrook Events," he said casually. "We were hired for the ceremony Saturday." "I didn't hire you. The HOA did." He said it like that. Ended the conversation. Across the yard, the wedding planner from the day before was directing workers like a movie director on a film set. "Move the arch closer to the tree," she shouted. "The photos will look better with the branches behind it." My branches, my tree, my yard. I walked straight up to her. "This has to stop," I said. "Right now." She gave me the same polite smile as before, but this time there was a hint of impatience in it. "Sir, the venue has already been reserved and paid for," she explained. "We have contracts, deposits, catering scheduled, the whole event." "How much did they pay?" I asked. She glanced at her clipboard. $8,000 for the venue package. $8,000 for my backyard. That's when the full picture started to sink in. Priscilla hadn't just told people they could use my property. She had sold it to strangers as a wedding venue. And judging by the growing pile of decorations, rented furniture, and lighting equipment filling my yard, this wasn't a small backyard ceremony anymore. This was becoming a full-scale wedding production, which meant by Saturday, dozens of guests would be sitting in chairs on my grass, watching 2 people get married on property that the HOA had absolutely no right to rent. And somehow, I was the only person who seemed to realize that. That night, I stopped trying to argue with people, because it was clear the wedding planners weren't going to listen to me. In their minds, they had paperwork, contracts, and a deposit paid through the HOA. As far as they were concerned, everything was official. And every time I tried to explain that the HOA had no right to rent my property, they just kept repeating the same line. "You'll have to take that up with the association." Fine. If that's how they wanted to play it, I would. But instead of arguing with Priscilla again, I decided to start making a few phone calls. The first call went to the county permit office. I kept the explanation simple. "Hi," I said. "Quick question. If someone wanted to host a wedding event for about 50 guests at a private residence, what kind of permits would they need?" The woman on the phone immediately started listing them. Temporary event permit, noise P, remote parking authorization, public gathering approval. "Okay," I said slowly. "And if none of those permits exist?" "Well," she replied, "then the event isn't legal." Interesting. My second call went to the city zoning department. I gave them my address and asked a different question. "Is my property zoned as an event venue?" There was a short pause as the man on the phone checked something. "No," he said. "That's a residential property. Could an HOA rent it out as a venue?" Another pause. Then he actually laughed. "Absolutely not." That was when things started getting interesting. Because if the HOA had taken money for an event on property they didn't own, without permits and without zoning approval, that wasn't just annoying. That was fraud. My third call went to someone I trusted, my friend Jake. Jake was a real estate attorney who had helped me once before during a boundary dispute with a developer years ago. And when I explained the situation, there was a long silence on the phone. Then Jake asked one question. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly. "Your HOA president sold your backyard as a wedding venue?" "Yep. And you never signed anything?" "Nope." Another pause. Then Jake chuckled. "Oh, this is going to be fun." "What do you mean?" "Well," he said, "first of all, she has absolutely no authority to do that. Second, if money changed hands, she's in serious legal trouble." I leaned back in my chair. "But here's the best part," Jake continued. "If they've already started installing structures or equipment on your land without permission, yes, you're legally allowed to remove them." I looked out my window toward the backyard. The wedding arch frame was already standing near my oak tree. Workers had even started anchoring decorative platforms into the ground. And suddenly, an idea started forming in my head. Because if they wanted to treat my property like a construction site, then maybe it was time to call someone who specialized in tearing construction sites apart. The moment the idea hit me, I couldn't stop smiling. Not because I enjoy chaos, but because for the first time since this whole ridiculous situation started, I realized something important. I didn't have to stop the wedding. I just had to let the law do it for me. The next morning I walked out into the backyard again. Workers were still busy transforming my lawn into something that looked like it belonged in a wedding magazine. The arch frame had been fully installed near the oak tree, and someone was securing wooden platforms into the grass to create a small stage for the ceremony. They had drilled metal anchors straight into my yard, without asking, without permission. And that detail was exactly what Jake had been talking about, because once structures were physically installed on private property without consent, the homeowner had very clear rights. I took several photos, close-ups of the anchors in the ground, wide shots of the platforms and arch, workers installing lighting cables along my fence. Then I sent everything to Jake. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. "Perfect," his message read. That was the only word he used. Perfect. An hour later, we were on the phone going through the plan. "Technically," Jake explained, "those installations count as unauthorized construction on private property, and under local property law, you have the right to remove anything installed without permission. So I can tear it down? You can hire someone to remove it," he said, legally. I looked out the window again at the growing wedding setup. The chairs were already stacked neatly near the fence. Flower boxes had been delivered. Someone had started hanging decorative lights from my oak tree. They were building a wedding venue in my backyard like it was completely normal. Jake continued speaking. "The important part is documentation," he said. "You've already told them to stop. You have proof they continued anyway." "Okay. And if you hire a licensed crew to remove the structures, yes, you're completely within your rights." I leaned back in my chair. "What about the timing?" Jake laughed. "Oh, timing matters a lot." "How so?" "Well," he said, "if the equipment gets removed before the event, the wedding can't happen." "Exactly." I looked at the calendar on my phone. Saturday. That was the day the ceremony was scheduled. Guests would arrive. The bride and groom would show up. Priscilla would probably stand there pretending she was some kind of event manager. And right before all of that happened, every illegal structure on my property would disappear. "So," Jake asked, "do you know any demolition companies?" I smiled. As a matter of fact, I did. The morning air was electric, a mix of anticipation, diesel, and freshly brewed coffee. and I could barely contain my excitement as I watched from the porch. Saturday had arrived, and with it, the culmination of weeks of careful planning, documentation, and legal maneuvering. The first clue that this day would be unforgettable came when I noticed the activity across my yard. Wedding chairs, flower arrangements, and decorative arches, installed without permission, stood ready as if mocking my patience. The audacity of it made me grin. Every single element was evidence, and every step they took was a gift. I checked my phone one last time. Jake's crew was on standby, fully briefed and licensed, ready to remove anything that had been illegally erected. I could almost hear him laughing through the speaker as he reminded me, documentation is key. Don't touch a thing yourself. Let them do the work, and let the law do the talking. The irony of the situation was delicious. Priscilla thought she was hosting a perfect wedding, but in reality, she had built her empire on a foundation of stolen property, unauthorized structures, and sheer audacity. And I had a front row seat. By 7 a.m., the first municipal inspectors arrived, clipboard in hand, meticulously noting every detail. Health and safety violations, structural concerns, and unauthorized commercial activity were all being recorded. The inspector's presence lent legitimacy to what I was about to do, transforming the backyard into a stage for both accountability and spectacle. Cameras were rolling too. Local news crews and independent journalists had shown up after learning about the ongoing fraud, ensuring that every move, every complaint, every violation was documented in real time. And then it happened. The bride's limousine turned the corner, and the first guests began to arrive. They were expecting a dream wedding, but instead, they were met with a surreal scene: government inspectors, construction equipment, and the unmistakable scent of diesel filling the morning air. Jake's team revved the excavator, hydraulics humming like a predator, preparing to strike. Each illegal platform, tent anchor, and decorative structure was a ticking time bomb of evidence, ready to explode into legal consequences. Priscilla arrived in her designer heels, flustered and panicked as the enormity of her situation became clear. Every camera, every witness, every official on site was a living record of her audacious theft. As she protested, it was impossible to ignore the mounting reality. This was not just demolition, it was justice performed on a stage where the world could watch. And in that moment, standing on my porch, coffee in hand, I realized the most satisfying truth. Sometimes the law, when combined with careful planning and a little patience, can deliver a drama far more spectacular than anything Hollywood could script. By mid-morning, the chaos had reached a level that even I couldn't have fully imagined. The first wedding guests were milling around, confused, camera phones out, capturing a scene that no one had expected. The smell of diesel mixed with fresh coffee, the clatter of inspectors' clipboards, and the distant roar of Jake's excavator created a soundtrack that felt almost cinematic. Every unauthorized structure that Priscilla had spent months or years erecting on my property was about to meet its fate. The irony was intoxicating. She had tried to turn my backyard into her personal empire, and now she was about to watch it crumble in real time, under the careful eye of the law. The excavator's claw moved with precision, lifting tent platforms, decorative arches, and even a makeshift outdoor kitchen, holding each for a dramatic pause before sending them crashing to the ground. Each collapse echoed across the neighborhood, drawing gasps from guests and laughter from me. The beauty of it wasn't just in the destruction. It was in the delivery of justice with zero legal ambiguity. Everything Jake removed had been documented meticulously, and every inspector, journalist, and camera on site ensured that Priscilla's fraud could never be spun in her favor. Priscilla herself appeared like a storm on the lawn, heels clicking across the gravel as she shouted about contracts and bookings. But the legal groundwork was flawless. Mrs. Kowaleski, armed with surveyor tools and clear property boundaries, demonstrated conclusively that every illegal installation sat squarely on my land. Cameras captured every reaction: Priscilla's shock, the horror on the bride's face, the astonishment of the guests, and the quiet satisfaction of those of us who had orchestrated this spectacular exposure of criminal activity. As the last of the structures came down, a sheriff's deputy stepped forward with handcuffs, placing Priscilla under arrest for multiple felony charges: construction fraud, theft of property improvements, and operating illegal commercial facilities. The applause from neighbors was almost deafening, a community witnessing the collapse of deceit in real time. The first wedding guests, initially bewildered, soon realized the magnitude of what had occurred. A staged wedding turned into a case study of fraud, resilience, and the power of meticulous planning. In the aftermath, the neighborhood transformed. HOAs were reformed, transparency rules were implemented, and the defrauded couples were made whole. My backyard, once a battlefield of deceit, became a place of genuine community gatherings, laughter, and legitimate celebrations. Even months later, the story continued to resonate, inspiring other subdivisions to scrutinize corruption and demand accountability. Standing there reflecting on the chaos, the destruction, and the eventual justice, it was clear that sometimes the most satisfying victories aren't quiet. They're spectacular, public, and impossible to ignore. The lesson was undeniable: build your foundations on honesty, or risk watching your empire crumble in front of everyone.